My name is Vivian Pierce. I'm 34 years old, and I just discovered that being too smart for your job can cost you everything, until it becomes the one thing that saves you. I never imagined that drafting the perfect legal clause would become my weapon of choice against the very people who threw me away like yesterday's coffee. Let me take you back to 3 months ago, when I was still naive enough to believe that competence was rewarded in corporate America. I'd been working as a senior legal consultant at Sterling, Whitmore and Associates for 6 years. Not just any law firm, we're talking about one of Manhattan's most prestigious corporate law practices. The kind of place where million-dollar deals happen over lunch, and your annual bonus could buy a house in the suburbs. My specialty? Mergers and acquisitions. I was the one they called when Fortune 500 companies wanted to dance the delicate waltz of corporate marriage. I could spot a potential legal landmine in a 300-page contract faster than most people could find their name on the document. But here's what I learned the hard way. Sometimes being indispensable makes you dispensable. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in October when Richard Sterling, the founding partner whose name graced the building, called me into his mahogany-paneled office. The same office where I'd presented countless successful cases, where I'd saved the firm millions in potential litigation costs. "Vivian," he said, not even looking up from his computer screen, "we need to talk." I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where clients paid $800 an hour to sit. Something felt off. Richard's usual confident demeanor seemed nervous. "I'll cut right to the chase," he continued, finally making eye contact. "We're going to have to let you go." The words hit me like a physical blow. 6 years. 6 years of 70-hour weeks, of missing family dinners, of building this firm's reputation alongside my own. "I don't understand," I managed to say. "My performance reviews have been exemplary. Just last month, I saved the Henderson merger from falling apart." Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. "That's exactly the problem, Vivian. You're overqualified for your position. The other partners feel that you know too much about our internal operations. It makes them uncomfortable." Overqualified. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. "Besides," he added, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression, "we've found someone more suitable for the role, someone who fits better with our firm's culture." That someone, I later discovered, was Richard's daughter, Madison Sterling. Fresh out of law school, zero experience in corporate law, but she had something I didn't, the right last name. As I cleaned out my office that afternoon, placing 6 years of my professional life into cardboard boxes, I felt something I'd never experienced before: the cold, calculated anger of someone who'd been systematically betrayed. But here's what Richard Sterling didn't know about me, what none of them knew. I didn't just review contracts, I crafted them. Every merger, every acquisition, every corporate restructure that had passed through Sterling, Whitmore and Associates in the last 3 years had my legal DNA embedded in its foundation, including the most important contract they'd ever worked on. Strategy and smart preparation. Over the next 2 weeks, I transformed from a devastated ex-employee into something much more dangerous: a lawyer with a legitimate grievance and an airtight legal strategy. The first thing I did was document everything. I compiled every email, every performance review, every piece of evidence that proved my termination was unjustified. Jonathan had been right. I wasn't just overqualified. I was inconvenient. Then I did something that would have made my law school professors proud. I researched every precedent case involving wrongful termination in the legal industry. I studied the sex enforcement patterns for securities violations. I mapped out exactly how the regulatory process would unfold once my clause was invoked. But I wasn't going to do this alone. I reached out to Elena Rodriguez, a former colleague who'd left Sterling, Whitmore and Associates 2 years earlier to start her own boutique firm. Elena specialized in employment law and had a reputation for taking on powerful law firms. "Vivian," she said when I called her, "I've been wondering when you'd reach out. Word is that Sterling threw you under the bus." "It's worse than that," I told her. "They threw me under the bus to cover up securities fraud." Elena's office was small but efficient, the kind of place where every resource was maximized for impact. As I laid out the entire situation, the wrongful termination, the skimmed fees, the regulatory violations, and most importantly, my clause, I watched Elena's expression shift from sympathy to excitement. This is brilliant, she said, studying the merger contract. You essentially wrote yourself a nuclear option and they never saw it coming. The question is, I said, how do we detonate it for maximum impact? Elena smiled. Leave that to me. While Elena worked on the legal mechanics, I focused on building an airtight case. I needed to prove not just that my termination was wrong, but that it was calculated to facilitate Richard's misconduct. I reached out to 3 other former Sterling employees who'd left under suspicious circumstances. What I discovered was a pattern. Richard had a history of removing anyone who might interfere with his less than ethical practices. Maria Santos, a paralegal who'd been fired for asking too many questions about client billing. David Chen, a junior associate who'd been let go after raising concerns about document retention policies. Patricia Williams, an administrative assistant who'd been terminated after she'd accidentally discovered discrepancies in client account management. All of them had been terminated within the past 18 months. All of them had been replaced by less experienced personnel with closer ties to Richard. But I had something none of them had, a clause that could stop a $2.8 billion merger dead in its tracks. The plan Elena and I developed was elegant in its simplicity. Phase 1, submit formal notice of wrongful termination and demand reinstatement within the 180-day window. Phase 2, when Richard inevitably refused, invoke the merger review clause. Phase 3, use the resulting SEC investigation to expose the broader pattern of misconduct. Phase 4, watch Richard's carefully constructed empire crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. But we needed perfect timing. The Meridian merger was scheduled to close in 6 weeks. Once the merger was complete, my clause would be harder to enforce, and Richard would have successfully covered up his tracks. 3 days before I was scheduled to submit my formal notice, I received an unexpected call. Ms. Pierce, this is Thomas Meridian, CEO of Meridian Technologies. I nearly dropped the phone. Thomas Meridian was worth approximately $1.2 billion and was known for his no-nonsense approach to business. Mr. Meridian, I managed to say, what can I do for you? I understand you were the primary legal consultant on our merger agreement with Apex Industries. That's correct. I also understand that Sterling, Whitmore and Associates terminated your employment shortly after completing the initial framework. I was silent, unsure where this conversation was headed. Ms. Pierce, I didn't build a billion-dollar company by ignoring red flags. When a firm fires their most competent lawyer right before closing a major deal, it raises questions. I'd like to meet with you. 2 days later, I sat in Thomas Meridian's corner office, 47 floors above Manhattan, explaining the situation to one of the most powerful businessmen in America. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Ms. Pierce, he finally said, I appreciate your honesty. More importantly, I appreciate your competence. How would you like to work for me? I'm flattered, Mr. Meridian, but I have some unfinished business with Sterling first. He smiled. I thought you might say that. When you're ready to move on, call me. In the meantime, if you need any resources for your unfinished business, let me know. As I left his office, I realized I wasn't just fighting Richard Sterling anymore. I had the backing of one of the most powerful men in corporate America. The war was about to begin. 2 weeks after my termination, I was working from my apartment, trying to rebuild my career from scratch. The legal industry is smaller than you'd think. Word travels fast when a senior consultant gets axed from a prestigious firm. That's when I received the call that changed everything. Ms. Pierce, this is Jonathan Whitmore Jr. from Whitmore and Associates. Jonathan was the junior partner, Richard's business partner's son. Unlike his father's partner, Jonathan had always treated me with respect. He was calling from his personal phone, not the firm's line. I need to meet with you, he said quietly. There's something you need to know about your termination. Can you meet me at Café Luna on 42nd Street in an hour? An hour later, I sat across from Jonathan in a crowded coffee shop, watching one of the most principled lawyers I knew struggle with his conscience. What I'm about to tell you, he began, stirring his coffee nervously, could destroy my career if anyone finds out I told you. I leaned forward. Jonathan, what's going on? Your firing had nothing to do with being overqualified. He paused, looking around the cafe. Richard needed you gone because of the Meridian deal. The Meridian deal. A $2.8 billion merger between Meridian Technologies and Apex Industries that had been in the works for 8 months. I'd been the lead consultant on the legal framework. Richard has been taking shortcuts, Jonathan continued, cutting corners on due diligence, overlooking potential regulatory violations. You are asking too many questions, digging too deep into their financial disclosures. My stomach dropped. How bad are we talking? Bad enough that if the SEC finds out, it won't just be fines. We're talking criminal charges for securities fraud. Jonathan's hands were shaking slightly. Richard thought if he removed you from the equation, he could rush the deal through before anyone noticed the irregularities. I sat back in my chair, processing this information. And Madison? His daughter? She's completely unqualified, but she's also completely compliant. She'll rubber stamp whatever Richard puts in front of her. Jonathan leaned closer. Vivian, there's more. Richard has been skimming consultation fees from the Meridian deal. We're talking about nearly $400,000 that should have gone to you and the other consultants. The betrayal was even deeper than I'd imagined. Not only had Richard fired me to cover up his own misconduct, but he'd been stealing from me in the process. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Jonathan looked me straight in the eye. Because what Richard is doing is wrong, and because I know you well enough to know you won't let this slide. Also, he hesitated, my father is planning to retire next year. If this Meridian deal blows up, it'll take the entire firm down with it, including his retirement fund. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could about the Meridian merger. What I found made my blood run cold. Richard hadn't just cut corners, he'd potentially violated about 7 different SEC regulations. The due diligence was so sloppy that any competent regulatory review would catch the problems immediately. But here's where the story gets interesting. As I was reviewing the merger documents, trying to understand the full scope of Richard's misconduct, I came across something that made me smile for the first time in weeks. Buried deep in the merger agreement, in Section 47, subsection C, paragraph 12, was a clause I'd written 6 months earlier. A little piece of legal language that seemed innocuous at first glance, but carried the power to stop the entire merger in its tracks. The clause read, in the event that any primary legal consultant who contributed to the foundational structure of this agreement is terminated without cause within 180 days of the merger completion, said consultant retains the right to invoke a comprehensive compliance review, suspending all merger activities until independent verification of all due diligence procedures is completed. I'd written that clause as a standard protection measure, thinking it would never be invoked. It was the kind of legal safety net that lawyers include, just in case. I never imagined I'd be the one using it. The beautiful irony? Richard had been so eager to get rid of me that he'd rushed through the final contract review. He'd never noticed the clause that would become his downfall. Madison, his inexperienced daughter, certainly hadn't caught it either. As I sat in my apartment, reading my own words in the contract, I realized something. Richard Sterling had just handed me the keys to his kingdom, execution and poetic justice. The final phase began on a crisp Monday morning in November, exactly 167 days after my termination. Elena and I walked into the Sterling, Whitmore and Associates building at precisely 9 a.m., carrying a briefcase containing the documents that would change everything. The receptionist recognized me immediately. Ms. Pierce? I thought you. I have a meeting with Mr. Sterling, I said calmly. He's expecting me. Of course, he wasn't expecting me. But within 5 minutes, Elena and I were sitting across from Richard Sterling in the same mahogany office where he'd destroyed my career 3 months earlier. Vivian, he said, clearly uncomfortable. I wasn't aware we had a meeting scheduled. We don't, I replied, placing a legal document on his desk. This is a formal notice of wrongful termination and demand for reinstatement, submitted within the 180-day contractual window as specified in the Meridian merger agreement. Richard's face went pale as he scanned the document. This is ridiculous. Your termination was completely legitimate. Was it? Elena interjected, sliding another document across the desk. This is a complaint filed with the New York State Bar Association detailing systematic misconduct, including securities fraud and employee theft. We're also filing a complaint with this SEC regarding the Meridian merger. But I wasn't done yet. Richard, I said, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. There's something else you should know. Section 47, subsection C, paragraph 12 of the Meridian Merger Agreement, the clause I wrote 6 months ago, gives me the right to invoke a comprehensive compliance review of the entire merger process. The color drained completely from Richard's face. You can't. I can, and I am. I placed one final document on his desk. This notice has already been submitted to both Meridian Technologies and Apex Industries. As of this moment, the $2.8 billion merger is suspended pending independent verification of all due diligence procedures. Richard's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone. I need to call our regulatory counsel. Good luck with that, Elena said. We've already contacted the Sex Enforcement Division. They're very interested in reviewing your due diligence practices. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, the SEC had launched a formal investigation into Sterling, Whitmore and Associates' handling of the Meridian merger. The firm's assets were frozen pending the investigation. Within a week, Richard Sterling was facing criminal charges for securities fraud and embezzlement. The $400,000 he'd skimmed from consultant fees was just the tip of the iceberg. The investigation uncovered nearly $2 million in fraudulent billing practices. Madison Sterling, the inexperienced daughter who was supposed to be my replacement, lasted exactly 3 days under SEC questioning before she broke down and admitted she'd rubber-stamped documents she didn't understand. But the most satisfying moment came 2 weeks later. I was sitting in Thomas Meridian's office, signing a contract to become his company's chief legal officer, when he showed me a news article from the Wall Street Journal. Sterling, Whitmore and Associates faces dissolution following SEC investigation, read the headline. You know, Thomas said, when I first heard about your situation, I thought it was just another case of corporate politics. I never imagined it would uncover this level of fraud. Neither did I admitted. I just wanted justice for what they did to me. Sometimes, he smiled, justice and revenge are the same thing. The final irony came 6 months later. Sterling, Whitmore and Associates was forced to liquidate all assets to cover legal fees and penalties. The building where I'd spent 6 years of my life was sold to pay Richard Sterling's victims. The buyer? Meridian Technologies. Thomas Meridian had purchased the building and offered it to me as the headquarters for my new legal division. I now run a team of 12 corporate lawyers from the same mahogany office where Richard Sterling once told me I was overqualified. My first hire was Jonathan Whitmore Jr., who had provided the crucial information that started my investigation. My second hire was Elena Rodriguez, my brilliant partner in bringing down a corrupt system. As for Richard Sterling, he was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $4.2 million in restitution. He lost his law license, his fortune, and his reputation. But the most poetic justice of all? The clause that brought him down, Section 47, subsection C, paragraph 12, is now known in legal circles as the Pierce Protocol. It's become standard language in merger agreements across the industry, protecting consultants and lawyers from exactly the kind of retaliation I experienced. Every time I see that clause in a contract, I smile. Sometimes, being overqualified is exactly what the world needs. Today, as I sit in my office looking out over Manhattan, I realize that Richard Sterling was right about one thing. I did know too much. I knew too much about law, too much about ethics, and too much about justice to let him get away with destroying everything I'd worked for. And that knowledge? It wasn't a liability. It was my greatest asset. The end. This story demonstrates that competence, preparation, and strategic thinking will always triumph over arrogance and corruption. Sometimes the very thing someone tries to use against you becomes the weapon that ensures their downfall.